Welcome back, everyone, to another Academic Masterclass Explainer. Today, we're cracking open TEMA 22 Notebook LM to take a really fascinating, rigorous dive into the mechanics of English temporal prepositions. If you're aiming for that C2 level mastery, or maybe you're gearing up for the Escuelas Oficiales de Idiomas exams, you are in the right place. We're going to completely unpack the grammar, the syntax, and those really subtle semantic shifts that distinguish a technically proficient speaker from a true master of the English language.
Okay, let's dive into this. We've got 6 structured sections to get through today. First, syntax and prepositions. Second, deferred prepositions. Third, time position. Fourth, duration and boundaries. Fifth, zero prepositions. And finally, number 6, EOI pedagogy.
All right, first up, Section 1, Syntax and Prepositions, laying the grammatical foundation. Because to truly understand time, we really have to master how these phrases behave first.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it breaks down prepositional phrases at that advanced C2 level. When they function as adverbials, we actually have to categorize them into 4 very specific syntactic roles. First, we've got adjuncts, and these are the ones that give us that essential circumstantial information. Like exactly when or where something went down. Then we have subjuncts, which are used to express a highly personal point of view. Disjunct step back and offer an evaluation of the sentence itself. And finally, conjuncts act as the glue. They serve a connective role, linking our thoughts logically. Getting a firm grip on these 4 categories is absolutely crucial. It's step 1 for manipulating English sentences with total precision.
So, drawing from the legendary work of Quirk and his colleagues back in 1985, we learned that a central preposition is actually defined by negative criteria, which just means it's defined by what it absolutely cannot do. A true central preposition can never be followed by a that clause, it can't be followed by an infinitive, and it can't be followed by the subjective case of a personal pronoun. For example, it's perfectly fine to say, I am surprised at her attitude, using the objective case, but there's just no way you can say, I am surprised at she. These really strict, non-negotiable boundaries are exactly what separate true prepositions from your standard subordinating conjunctions. Moving right along to Section 2, Deferred Prepositions. This is all about the stranding phenomenon. And this brilliantly illustrates the constant tension we see between prescriptive grammar rules and how humans actually speak. So, formal fronting dictates that we build structures like, at which house did you leave the car? But let's be real, informal stranding, which defers that preposition all the way to the end, gives us the much more natural, which house did you leave the car at? Modern linguists totally recognize that fronting often sounds incredibly stilted and robotic, making stranding the clear preference for natural, fluent, everyday English. But hold on. Because sometimes deferment isn't just a fun stylistic choice, it's actually an absolute grammatical obligation. Take passive constructions, for instance, like, has the room been paid for? You literally cannot front that preposition. It doesn't work. The exact same rule applies to infinitive clauses, like, he is impossible to work with, and ing clauses, like, he's worth listening to. If you try to move those prepositions around, the entire structure of the sentence just collapses. All right, Section 3, Time Position. This is where we start mapping physical space directly onto time. To truly master time position, we have to conceptualize how English moves from the highly precise tiny points all the way out to massive, expansive periods. Think of it kind of like a camera zooming out. At maps onto very specific points and clock times, like at 10 o'clock. Then we zoom out slightly with on, which broadens out to hit days and dates, like on Monday. Next, in expands even further to capture much longer periods. We're talking months, years, entire centuries. Think in August or in 1969. And finally, we have by, which introduces a strict boundary. It functions as a terminal point, basically meaning not a second later than. Ultimately, it's all about how much metaphorical space that specific chunk of time occupies. Now, what happens when we need to measure time relative to right now, the present moment? Well, English relies on some very strict directional rules here. If you are measuring backwards, looking into the past, you've got to use the postponed adverb ago. But if you want to measure forward into the future, from this exact moment, in is your standard go-to, like saying in 3 months' time. Mixing these two up, that's an immediate red flag that breaks the natural temporal logic of the language. Let's shift gears now to Section 4, Duration and Boundaries. We're looking at the limits of time. Let's analyze the critical semantic difference here between included and excluded duration. So in a positive sentence, the action is included right there in the time span. I've done it for years. but throw a negative into the mix, and the action is suddenly excluded from the span. Fascinatingly enough, this exposes a major dialectical divide. While British English speakers might naturally say, I haven't done that for years, American English shows this really strong preference for using the word in during excluded duration. So you'll hear, I haven't done that in years. Now, this next concept is just a complete semantic flip. Take a look at how until behaves based purely on whether the sentence around it is positive or negative. In a positive sentence like, we slept until midnight, until clearly marks the end of the action, right? The sleeping officially stopped at midnight. But make it a negative sentence. We didn't sleep until midnight. And suddenly until marks the start of the action. The sleeping didn't even begin until midnight. It's wild how the boundary marker completely changes its fundamental meaning based entirely on the verb's polarity. And as leading linguistic authorities like Biber, Carter, and McCarthy point out, the way we define endpoints also exposes some major geographical divides. When defining a span of time, British English typically relies on from June to September. But American English frequently employs the word through, saying June through September. And they do this specifically to ensure that the endpoint is explicitly included in the span. Using through absolutely guarantees that the very end of September is part of the package, which completely avoids that slight lingering ambiguity you get with the word to. Which brings us to section 5, zero prepositions, because sometimes the absolute most important grammatical rule is knowing when to say nothing at all. For advanced learners, you absolutely must memorize the specific triggers that create what linguists call the zero preposition phenomenon. You will consistently drop the preposition right before deictic words. These are words that point to specific times based purely on the speaker's context, words like last, next, this, or that. You also drop prepositions before quantifiers like some and every, which is why we say things like every summer. And finally, inherently time-based nouns like today or tomorrow, they literally never take a preposition. So the crucial point here is that the type of verb you're using actually dictates the rules of omission. If you have a state of verb, a verb expressing a basic state of being, the preposition is often totally optional. You can say stayed there 3 months, perfectly naturally, without ever needing the word for. However, if you're dealing with dynamic, action-oriented verbs, or you're making any kind of negative statement, dropping that preposition instantly makes the sentence ungrammatical. Suddenly, the preposition becomes absolutely obligatory. Let's bring it all home with Section 6 EOI pedagogy. We're looking at the real-world implications for the classroom. For those teaching candidates out there, here are your actionable takeaways. True C2 mastery, it isn't about direct one-to-one translation from a student's native language. It's all about teaching metaphorical mapping, helping your students literally visualize time as a physical landscape. It's about actively conducting contrastive analysis between UK and US boundaries, so they actually understand global variations. And crucially, it's about register management, teaching them that prepositional stranding isn't inherently wrong. It's simply a dynamic tool used to smoothly transition from writing a highly formal academic essay to having a completely natural professional conversation. We've covered the syntax, the complex boundaries, and the specific pedagogy of English temporal prepositions. But as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a pretty provocative thought. If all of these intricate grammatical rules are essentially built on mapping physical space onto our concept of time, what happens next? How might our increasingly digital, largely spaceless online environment shape the future grammar of time itself? Think about that as you continue your journey toward absolute mastery. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into TEMA 22, and keep exploring.